Well, welcome to the Middlesex Moments radio show. I'm Anna Wasesha, president of Middlesex Community College, and today I have, I think, my most favorite repeat guest, Steve Krevisky, who teaches mathematics here, but I think as most of our listeners may already know, he knows more about baseball than any other person I have ever met in my entire life, and he could fill weeks and weeks of shows about baseball. So he comes back to talk about it sometimes at the beginning of the season. Now we're kind of closing in on the end of the season, sort of, maybe. And then we sometimes do I would say Monday morning quarterback, but there's got to be a baseball term for that, where we look back and review the season and imagine what the next one will be, because the American pastime is a perennial pastime. And, as bad as one season could be, the next one could be remarkable. So I was saying, apart from going to a Twins game this last summer in Minneapolis, I don't really know what's going on with baseball. So we have a half hour. So tell us, Steve, and welcome.
Anna, thank you for having me. And we're at about the three-quarter point of the season. There's about 40 games left. And one of the major stories is what's the playoff picture looking like? I know for you Red Sox fans out there, it hasn't been a good year for a number of reasons. The future's with the young kids and bolstering their pitching staff. The Yankees have been in first place or close to first place for quite some time, but they've been a little shaky lately. They swept the Twins, sorry Anna, and then lost 3 out of 4 to the Indians, and now they're playing Houston, which could be a playoff matchup. So in terms of the bigger picture, then remember there's 5 teams from each league that go into the playoffs. The division winners from each of the 3 divisions, and then the next 2 teams with the next best record who didn't finish first become wild cards. So since you have 5 playoff positions in each league, then you have people fighting for the playoffs. A few weeks ago was the trading deadline, July 31st. So it was interesting to see what teams made what moves. So Toronto really helped themselves. They got David Price from Detroit and Troy Tulowitzki from Colorado. So Tulowitzki is a power-hitting shortstop, and David Price is a high-level pitcher. So Toronto really helped themselves, and they had a strong offense to begin with, and they've given the Yankees a lot of trouble. So Toronto is a team to be reckoned with. Kansas City, who went to the 7th game of the World Series last year, got Johnny Cueto, a pitcher from Cincinnati, so Kansas City strengthened themselves. And over in the National League, your Cardinals are doing well. They've had the best record in the major leagues pretty much the whole year. The Pirates are chasing them in second place, and the Cubs have been playing better. So it's quite likely that those 3 teams will be in the playoffs. If there's any Met fans out there in the audience, the Mets are doing pretty well with the influx of young pitching. And then the Dodgers are in first place in the West, and the defending champion Giants are going to have to push to make the playoffs. So that's part of the landscape of what's going on.
So we have to take a break, but we'll come back and then let's dig deeper into what you just described, because there's a lot of information there. We'll be right back. Well, we're back, and I'm talking with Steve Krevisky today about baseball, the American pastime. And at the beginning of the program, he was talking about the trading day. So what's the history of deciding 3/4 of the way through the season or halfway through that people would start trading players?
Well, the trading deadline has been around for quite some time. It used to be in June, but for several years it's been July 31st. So what happens is if a team thinks they're in contention in July, then they'll be starting to think about what can they do to strengthen their team for a playoff run. If a team has slid out of contention, then they're going to be trading or selling players. So teams often have to decide what do they want to do. Now in the Yankees case, they didn't really make any moves, I think because they were figuring they didn't want to trade any of their prospects like high-rated pitcher Luis Severino or first baseman Greg Bird, and there's other people waiting in the wings. So therefore, historically, teams have been able to make moves right up until the trading deadline to either strengthen themselves by trades or buying people, or if a team was out of contention, selling or trading players to make way for youth. And maybe also there's a term that's out there called the salary dump. If a team is out of contention and they're looking to trade people with big contracts, like the Red Sox traded Adrian Gonzalez and Josh Beckett and a couple of others to the Dodgers a few years ago, and which was basically a salary dump to get rid of high salaried players who weren't really contributing that much.
So on the receiving end, though, why would the Dodgers have why would you be the dumpee, so to speak, in that?
Good question. Well, I think the Dodgers insisted on getting Adrian Gonzalez, who's a power-hitting first baseman. So while the Red Sox maybe didn't want to see Gonzalez go, they had to include him as part of that deal. And trading Josh Beckett was a plus at the time because he was one of the ringleaders of the Red Sox collapse about 4 years ago, the business about beer in the clubhouse and stuff like that affected their September collapse. And Beckett at times was very good, but there were other times when he wasn't. So the Red Sox felt they had a clean house. And so to make that deal, they had to include Adrian Gonzalez because the Dodgers insisted on that.
So I'm always kind of curious about the relationship between the identity of a team. I've always been loyal to the Cardinals and the Twins, for example, and the actual players who make up that team. Because if you're trading these individuals, do they bring with them this, I used to be a Yankee, I was a Yankee player, I identify with the Yankees, but now I'm playing for the Dodgers. So how does that work? And how does a team, kind of rebuild cohesiveness if you're shifting these kind of high-profile players in the middle of the season?
That's a very good question, Ada, because in the old days, in the 50s and 60s, the team was pretty stable. So, for instance, when I think about like the Yankees in my childhood, since I'm from New York, and I think about like Mickey Mantle and Roger Maris, those are the Yankees I grew up with, and I could, a lot of you listeners out there could probably name the whole team, the Yankees or Red Sox or Dodgers or whoever you rooted for, because it was a pretty stable roster. I mean, there were some changes from time to time, but nowadays, with free agency and players coming and going, there's twice as many teams as there were. It does get harder to keep track, and there's a lot of new faces. Now, in the old days with a reserve clause, which bound a player to the team for the duration of the player's career, the players didn't have a lot of rights and they didn't make a lot of money. With the advent of free agency, which dates back to the 70s, then players developed mobility to move around and make what seems now to be astronomical salaries, which wasn't always the case. So with all the movement, it can be hard to keep track, and sometimes even if you make a lot of moves, like for instance, over the winter the San Diego Padres got Matt Kemp from the Dodgers, a power-hitting outfielder, and right before opening day, the Padres got Craig Kimbrell, the Braves' top closer, one of the best closers in the game, but the Padres have had a bad year, so sometimes these moves don't work out. So it's a lot to keep track of these days. All the new faces, and out in Chicago, because my annual convention of the Society for American Baseball Research was in Chicago a couple of months ago, people were excited about Chris Bryant, the phenom who hit a lot of home runs in spring training, and Anthony Rizzo, who used to be with the Red Sox.
And who's he with now?
Well, he's now with the Cubs.
Right, because that was the Cubs versus the Twins.
Right, and via San Diego.
The game I saw, yeah.
Because the Cubs now have Theo Epstein as their GM and Jed Hoyer, both of whom had been with the Red Sox. So when Rizzo came up with the Red Sox, they knew about him.
So let's talk about, it's SABR, right? Is the Society for American...
Society for American Baseball Research.
So what was there a keynote, and what was what were you...
Well, we have We have player panels, Cubs and White Sox. We went to Wrigley Field and the Dodgers won 4-0, and that's like a historic ballpark. Wrigley Field is second to Fenway in terms of most number of years of continuous use in the major leagues, at least in the U.S. major leagues. And there's a statue of Ernie Banks, Mr. Cub, right in front of the main entrance with that big red sign, "Welcome to Wrigley Field." And I did a presentation via poster about should Ernie Banks have won the 58 and 59 MVP awards. And I included some images of the 59 Topps baseball cards, and I would advise listeners to save your memorabilia because my shoebox got thrown out when we moved.
When you were a kid, yeah.
Moved in 7th grade. So Wrigley Field is a special place for a lot of people.
Well, and outdoor baseball, right?
That's right. Yeah. And also there's a big Cubs-White Sox rivalry. Cubs on the north side of Chicago, White Sox on the south side of Chicago.
There's the Mets and the Yankees. There aren't very many cities that have both, but that have two teams, right?
You're right, not as much as there used to be. In Southern California, you have the Angels and the Dodgers. Boston used to have two teams, the Red Sox and Braves. The Braves moved to Milwaukee in '53. St. Louis used to have two teams, the Cardinals and the Browns.
Yes.
The Browns moved to Baltimore in 1954. Philadelphia used to have two teams, the A's and the Phillies. The A's moved to Kansas City in '55. So in the '50s, you started to see a lot of movement of franchises along with the integration of baseball and stuff like that.
What does that mean, movement to franchises?
Well, between 1903 and 1953, there were 8 teams in the American League and 8 teams in the National League. Whoever finished first in each league won the pennant and faced each other in the World Series. There were no wild cards or divisions and stuff like that. And so in each city whether there was one team or two teams, you knew all the players because there wasn't as much movement of players as there is today. And so starting in 1953, when the Braves moved from Boston to Milwaukee, that was the first of a number of franchise movements. And then later on, there was expansion in the 60s.
So basically, it meant that they took the franchise, they took the name and the cachet they'd built in the marketplace, and they moved it to Milwaukee in that instance of the Boston. In the same way that if you open up a McDonald's, and the franchise is you kind of license somebody to use that name and that identity in another location. Okay, I understand. So when I was in Minneapolis this summer, I was stunned by the economic impact of the new Target Stadium there and of the kind of it's always been a baseball town, but it clearly is a baseball town. There's like no question that it's a baseball town. So what about the economic impact of these franchises? So did Boston suffer at all by losing the Braves to Milwaukee? And does it diminish a city to have less than?
Well, that's a good question. I think what historically often happened was that in 2-team cities, and New York had 3 before the Dodgers and Giants left. What often happened historically was that one team out of the 2 was the more predominant one. So in Boston, the Red Sox were predominant, and the Boston Braves started losing attendance. The Boston Braves won the pennant in 1948 with, Spot and Saint and Pray for Rain, that slogan. But by the early 50s, even with Eddie Matthews being this great rookie in 1952, the Braves were on the way down, and Lou Perini, the owner, thought that moving them to Milwaukee would be a good change. So St. Louis, similarly, the Browns missed their opportunity in 1922 to win the pennant. They missed out by 1 game when the Yankees won the pennant. Had the Browns won that pennant, St. Louis could have been different, because then when the Cardinals won in 26 and started their run of excellence, then that ended up with the Browns being sort of the second-class citizens, and that could have easily changed in the 1920s.
Well, we have to break again, but when we come back, let's talk some more about about all of this, but I'm especially interested in hearing about the what happens to those teams in the first few years where they move to another community and how that happens. So we'll be right back.
Good.
Well, we're back for the final segment of Middlesex Moments radio show, and our triannual? 3 times a year, I think, we come and talk about baseball. Steve Krevisky has joined me. He's just an idolized mathematics professor, and there can't be very many of them because math is, difficult, and people always shy away from it. But people love your classes, and as a result, we have people leaving this college who go all the way through multivariable calculus, which is a huge testimony to the success of you as a professor and your whole department. So math is a very cool thing at Middlesex, and I would be remiss if I didn't say something about it. But now we can spin math into economics and go back into baseball and say, what happens to these communities who invest public dollars and say, and at some point, was it 1953, Milwaukee said, we'd like to have the Braves here in Milwaukee. So what happened with that transaction? Did the city provide support for a public stadium, for example, and did it really help Milwaukee get on the map? Because I think that's what a lot of these cities who get into the bartering and the sort of vying for these franchises, what they hope is that it'll bring other economic benefits to their communities.
Well, I can speak to that from not only what I've read about it, but also I lived in the Milwaukee area. I was teaching out there in the early 80s before I came east again. And I know that they're very rabid fans. They try to convert me away from my New York loyalty, which wasn't going to happen. But and there's also, of course, a lot of nice people out there. As an aside, I did enjoy that. But I would say that it did put Milwaukee on the map. In fact, I just finished a book called Bushville that documents the Braves' rise in Milwaukee to beating the Yankees in the '57 series, because I think in a lot of the New Yorkers, and especially I think manager Casey Stengel of the Yankees and maybe others, thought that Milwaukee was a Bush League city. Milwaukee for a long time had the Milwaukee Brewers, a minor league team in the American Association, and they played at Borchard Field. So when the Braves came to Milwaukee, and they actually moved in March of '53 in terms of packing everything up, they played at County Stadium. And from what I've read about it, the Braves were hugely popular, and for like 4 or 5 years in a row through the mid to late '50s, the Braves drew over 2 million people a year. And they quickly rose into contention with Eddie Matthews arriving, and then Hank Aaron in '54. They already had Warren Spahn. They got Burdette from the Yankees. And the Yankees traded the young Lou Burdette to the Braves for Johnny Sain, because in those days the Yankees traded youth for veterans to help them win at the time. And Burdette got some payback because in the '57 series he beat the Yankees 3 times. One of only a handful of World Series pitchers who've won 3 games in a series. So the Braves were very popular. They drew very well. And through the late '50s, they were one of the strongest teams in the National League. In fact, with a few breaks, they could have won 4 pennants in a row from '56 to '59. And by the way, as a statistical aside for the listeners out there, in each World Series from '55 to '58, each series went 7 games, and each year the road team won the 7th game, which ties into what you often talk about in terms of home field advantage. So the Braves did very well in Milwaukee for those several years. But then that started to fade because after the Braves lost the '59 playoff to the Dodgers, they started to slide in the '60s. They were never really a serious contender after that. And then they moved to Atlanta in '66.
And then, so they're really a migratory team. So then what happened in Atlanta? Did Atlanta say we want to get on the map in terms of professional sports? We want baseball here?
Well, Atlanta had also had minor league teams like the Atlanta Crackers and stuff like that. But they weren't major league teams in that area. There's a number of minor league teams in a lot of those southern places. So while the Braves didn't win in Atlanta right away, they were they were in the playoffs in 1969 when baseball expanded yet again and instituted divisional play. And so the Braves lost in the playoffs to the Mets, the Miracle Mets of '69. But then the Braves didn't make it to the World Series until many years later. But then, with Hank Aaron playing in Atlanta, and of course in '74 he passed Ruth's career record when he hit his 715th home run against a former Yankee pitcher, Al Downing, then of the Dodgers. Aaron went through, unfortunately, a lot of the same racist stuff that Jackie Robinson and others had gone through, but Aaron was a tremendous player. And a little trivia question for the audience. I'm not going to give you the answer right now, but who was the only Brave to play for the franchise in Boston, Milwaukee, and Atlanta? And he was on the cover of this first ever Sports Illustrated in 1954.
Boy, I will take a big pause and let people think about that. I have no idea, so I can't possibly offer a suggestion of an answer, but we got to remember to come back to it at the very end of the show. Let me ask you, because as you were talking, I was thinking, is there a professional baseball team in it's North America now, right? Toronto, and is there another major Canadian city with a team?
Well, Toronto has the Blue Jays, who won back-to-back World Series in '92 and '93. There used to be the Montreal Expos.
Oh, of course.
But then they moved and became the Washington Nationals.
Aha. Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, that happened several years ago. And I think what that relates to your question, Anna, about how cities view their teams. A lot of the recent ballparks have been in downtown facilities like Camden Yards in Baltimore, what used to be the Jake in Cleveland, now Progressive Field. I think the idea of a downtown ballpark, which minor league cities like Memphis have done also, I think is a good idea, because I've been in Montreal several times, and their baseball stadium was up by the Olympic site, several stops away on their subway. It's a great subway system. I wish we had that, but it's like 10 or 12 stops away. It was not a good baseball field. It was very cavernous, and I'd like to think Montreal would have been better served by a downtown ballpark.
Well, and the Nats are absolutely downtown in D.C.
That's right.
So, and the new Target Stadium in Minneapolis that I was at in June moved there from Bloomington, which is where the Mall of America is, but it's still kind of suburban. It's off the beaten track. And
I like Target Field. The Sabre Convention was there 3 years ago, and we could walk to the games.
Right.
So that was a nice facility.
And there are restaurants everywhere,
and
there's the light rail and pedal carts, something like that. They're driven by the passengers in these little wagons. They're drinking beer and pedaling bicycle pedals. And somebody's steering.
Approach.
Yeah, right. And they're hooting and hollering and getting ready for the game and then reliving the game afterwards. What I was going to ask is, are there any teams that have never won a World Series?
There are a few.
And they still manage to soldier on. What can you think of one or
Well,
two?
the Texas Rangers came close. They were in the series in 2010 against the Giants and 2011 against the Cardinals. Now that latter one was the series where the Cardinals had to come back 2 or 3 times. They were like maybe one strike away from losing, but the Cardinals came back to win. And teams who have lost the series 2 years in a row have not done well the third year. And so Texas is playing better of late, but they've never won a World Series. Seattle has never won a World Series.
The Mariners? It's the Seattle Mariners.
The Mariners. Right? Now the Mariners had that great team in 2001 when Ichiro was a rookie. They won 116 games, which ties the modern record set by the Cubs in '06, but the Yankees knocked the Mariners out of the playoffs.
So Mariners and Rangers, anybody else?
In the National League, the Padres have never won a World Series. They've been there a couple of times, losing in '84 to the Tigers and '98 to the Yankees. So the Padres have never won. The Rockies have never won. They lost to the Red Sox in '07. So there's a few teams out there. Of course, the Nationals Expos.
Sure.
So
we're going to keep an eye on those teams. Well, we have a very short period of time left, so you have to give us the answer. So what player went from Boston to Milwaukee to Atlanta?
Eddie Matthews.
All right. So we got that settled. And who's going to be in the World Series this fall?
Well, the way things are going, I think one real possibility is the Cardinals and Royals, which would be a rematch of 1985, which was called the I-70 series.
Yeah, exactly. Highway 70,
That's
St.
right.
Louis and Kansas City, KC.
Right, because those two teams have respectively the best records in each league, although of course the so-called best team doesn't always win, as we saw last year when the Giants and the Royals were both wild card teams. I would say watch out for the Pirates. The Pirates are doing very well. And I'd also say watch out for Toronto. I don't think the Yankees are good enough to get there, much as I wish they would, but I don't think they're strong enough.
Well, I love this. So this is, in my mind, this is St. Louis and Kansas City against each other. That would be perfect. So when it's all over, said and done, we'll have another show, and we'll talk about what happened last year and what we think will happen next year. So Steve Krevisky, thank you so much for being on Middlesex Moments Radio Show. It's always so much fun to talk baseball with you. I'm Anna Wasesha, president of Middlesex Community College, wishing you all a very good day.